and welcome to another episode of the Sumer Sports Podcast. I'm your summertime Wednesday host, Parker Fleming, here again with another interview in our long series of interviewing smart and interesting people around the world of sports analytics. This week, I'm very excited for our guest. I have with me Cade Massey, practice professor at the Wharton School and sports analytics legend, if I may say so myself. Cade, great to have you here. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Parker. Delighted to be here. Appreciate you being interested.
We are this whole summer. We have just been taking time as Thomas and Eric have been taking care of the Monday show. We have been here on Wednesday, normally accompanied by my co-host and colleague Tej Seth, who is certainly disappointed he couldn't be here this week, but he's off and otherwise occupied. So I'm here and very, very excited about this interview as we just talk about a few things in the world of sports analytics, in the world of how people might think about football, and wherever else that takes us. So where we've kind of started all of these, Cade, has been generally, I want to know about your background and kind of how you got into sports analytics. Now, of course, that's a loaded question and a long question because, of course, you have a prolific career outside of sports analytics with your teaching and all of that. So in the most direct way as you could, given that, how did you get into sports analytics, thinking about the NFL and thinking about applying some of the stuff you were learning in your courses and in your research to the world of the NFL?
I definitely know exactly when, because it's the origin of the paper I wrote with Thaler on the NFL draft. It was the 99 draft. And it was, I remember being in my colleague and friend's office, George Wu, faculty at Chicago. And we were just kicking around the draft because they were talking about this great quarterback draft of 99. That was Tim Couch and Achilles Smith and Donald McNabb, those guys. And the whole rhetoric around that draft was, this is the best draft since 83, which of course was Elway and Kelly and Marino. But I didn't think they'd learned the lesson of 83. I thought the lesson of 83 was that you can't really tell who's going to be better because Marino was the last of the 5 or 6 quarterbacks taken in that first round. I mean, Todd Blackledge went before him. Tony Eason went before him. The lesson should have been, this is really hard to predict. And yet the rhetoric in 99 was that Tim Couch was consensus number 1. There was debate about 2 through 5, 2 through 6. But everyone agreed Tim Couch was the top prospect. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, based on 83, I don't know. That led to our digging into the data. We thought, let's test this notion of overconfidence, which was very well established in the psych literature, but only with really experimental data. Let's test it with some real world data. Maybe the NFL draft is an interesting place to look at overconfidence.
And it's so interesting to me that you have some things stay the same. I feel like now we're saturated with hype and overconfidence in talking up prospects as people in kind of the draft industry try to differentiate themselves, but then also identify diamonds in the roughs because the stakes are so high, and you still get these people hyped and potentially these, is Will Levis going to be a top 5 pick? He falls out of the first round, or Malik Willis last year. That was still happening before Twitter and before the internet in kind of this overconfidence in evaluation skill. Is that correct to say that the overconfidence is in the team's own ability to project which player is going to be the best payoff in the long run?
That's an easy way to put it. In fact, the first stat we ever dug into just to ask, is this worth going further? Is it worth investing in? Was just to ask how likely is a guy taken in the draft to be better than the next guy at his position? So the second quarterback versus the third, the first linebacker versus the second, whatever, within position, what are the chances that one guy's better than the next one taken? And that turns out to be 52% across all positions across the whole draft is 52%, which is obviously real close to a coin flip. But this is often the choice that these teams are making when they decide whether to trade up or not. It's like they can't wait for that third running back. They need to trade up and get the second running back or whatever. They're often going to get one guy over another. So this is exactly the relevant comparison. And they're too sure they know which of those two guys is going to be better. That's just classic overconfidence. And by the way, it's hard. I mean, look, this is a really hard business. There's no failure in not being able to predict which of these two guys. The failure is in not recognizing, how much uncertainty there is.
Absolutely. And one thing that struck me and now we're kind of getting into talking about your, I think it was a Sloan presentation in 2011, an accompanying paper, Flipping Coins in the War Room, Skill and Chance in the NFL Draft. And just looking at, again, how replicable is success. And you kind of, I love the quote there was the paper was a resounding failure to find evidence of persistent drafting ability, that there wasn't this positive correlation across these teams are getting surplus value this year, so they're getting surplus value next year, or whether they're getting surplus value across the entire draft. And looking at this simply with kind of the ratio of, draft pick capital and ratio of surplus value to look, are these equated, was really, really simple, I thought, in an interesting way. In your experience, talking to people in the industry, talking to NFL teams, is communicating the idea, hey, you're not actually this good at that, been very difficult?
It's really difficult. It's difficult. It's not just in sports, it's in other industries as well, where the same message applies. And it's not that they're not good at it, because they are very good. They're some of the best in the world at it. It's that they're not provably better than the next team. Like, these guys are all kind of equally good at a very challenging task. And it means that relative performance is really noisy. It's hard to find someone who's consistently outperforming their draft position in picking players. It's generally not the way that teams outperform. They get good drafts and bad drafts, but those good drafts don't persist. The bad drafts don't persist. We've looked at it in a number of different ways. We've looked at, by the way, when we did that in whatever, you just gave me a year. Thank you for that, 2011. I mean, I did that analysis for a team. It was a little consulting project. And you ask whether it's hard to hear. I ran these numbers. They were definitive that there's just almost no signal in how a team performs in any one draft. And I send it to them, and I'm waiting for this, accolades for the good analysis. And I call my guy finally. I'm like, well, what'd they say? Because I wasn't there when this result went in. And what he said to me, Parker, was he said they couldn't hear it. They couldn't hear it. It's a heck of a phrase that's always stayed with me. And in fact, it has led me to cultivate some more lessons around, okay, what should we do when uncertainty is so high? Because you can't just, we in my field have beaten people about the head for years that they don't recognize uncertainty enough, that they're overconfident. We just kind of hit them over the head, but we don't tell them instead do something else. But there's lots of things that you should do. You can't just throw up your hands. You just go about your decision-making differently. So for example, in the NFL draft, the obvious thing now that gets talked about all the time is you want more picks. If it's just a lottery, you don't want to pay for choosing a certain number. You want to get as many draft picks as possible. And so there's just a different orientation whenever uncertainty is really high. And I think the more you can push that there are active strategies, there's wise approaches you can take in highly uncertain environments, it makes that message more palatable.
Definitely. And it's hard to, I think that we've seen NFL teams try to anticipate the correcting of the market by saying, okay, well, if everyone wants to trade down, then at some point the price for trading up is going to get low enough that I'm going to get surplus value. But teams, I feel like, consistently jump the gun trying to anticipate the market correction, when in reality, there's still so much uncertainty that consolidating multiple draft picks into a single draft pick is almost never a winning move, just because of how hard prediction is. And again, that gets into your loser's curse paper, which I want to talk about here in a second. I think this is an interesting question that gels right with your flipping coins paper by, I believe this is Shan Donahue says, is there any consistency in teams succeeding at certain draft slots? Like, are teams consistently hitting in their top picks, their top 15? Your work had some comments about the back half of the first round actually being more surplus value on average, correct?
Right. The paper with Thaler showed that the basically picks in the second half of the first round are more valuable than picks in the first half of the first round, quite surprisingly. But the short of it is because they're so expensive, and obviously the guys at the top are better, but they're not so much better that they're worth how much more they cost. But I took the question to be also about, are there places in the draft where maybe skill is a little bit more identifiable, or more or performance is more predictable? And this is one thing you hear from teams. They'll say, well, this, day 3, I get it. It's pretty much a lottery, but no. There's more skill in those first couple of days. We don't see it. I think there's probably a little more persistence, but we're talking about goes from, 0 to 0.05 or 0.1 at the most persistence from one to the next whenever you go to the top of the draft.
Yeah, I love the graph about the correlation coefficients where they were just all zero across the board. It's just flat and very small, and just not a lot of signal there. Okay, so I'm looking, and I think the first mention of this or a draft curve from you that I can find is this overconfidence versus market efficiency in the National Football League paper with Thaler, and this is an NBER draft in 2005. Is that that sounds about right timeline wise, as being kind of the first time of let's create a draft curve, let's formalize this?
Yeah, our first working paper was '05. That's right.
Great. Well, okay. So as an economist, one, I have to ask, how was it having Richard Thaler as a as an advisor? It looks like he was very supportive to working with you and maybe working with you on weird ideas at bringing the NFL into an economics department.
Well, Dick's no stranger to weird ideas. That's one of his strengths, is being open to all kinds of ideas. And I was lucky. He came to Chicago right as I was starting a PhD program. Actually, I wasn't even starting. I was in the master's program still. He arrived kind of when I was thinking about it, and I happened to take the first PhD class he ever taught, and we got along. I liked the field, and we got along, and so that was the beginning of the relationship. I was probably lucky. I'm guessing that he was kind of in the market for PhD students. When you first arrive, you don't have that queue of students yet. So I was at the right place at the right time. Thaler's a terrific advisor, co-author. And one of the fun things about this project is that it took us a long time to get it published, which isn't great, but it did mean we spent a lot of time working on this thing together. And then when we started working with NFL teams, it meant that we started doing a lot of fun non-academic things together. And so it's been a rich partnership. It's been a rich part of my life, and I've been very blessed that he's been along for the ride.
Yeah, that's awesome. I want to go. I'm tempted to go line by line and just look at your papers and talk, but I want to zoom out just a little bit. So you're writing some papers with Dr. Thaler. You're consulting for some NFL teams. How does that transition from kind of academic research? You're maintaining your own academic research outside of the NFL, producing or publishing papers that are unrelated to football, unrelated to sports analytics, but certainly in the domain of risk and uncertainty. How does that transition into Wharton Moneyball? How does that transition into creating power rankings for different teams and getting into the betting side of things?
Those transitions are pretty direct in that the Massey-Peabody, the seeds of Massey-Peabody. So that's my partnership with Rufus Peabody. He was a student at Yale, undergraduate student at Yale. There's a Wall Street Journal writer, active in fantasy circles, active in other sports writing circles, named Mike Salfino. Salfino wrote an article about my paper with Thaler. And so he was familiar with that research, a Wall Street Journal article. He then decided, along with the editors at Wall Street Journal, to do a power rankings, for NFL power rankings. This was like 08, 09. This was early in the power rankings game. And he sent me his ideas on power rankings. And I thought, and I like Salfino a lot. I'm like, well, I've got some thoughts here, but it's a little bit cheap for me just to say, do this, do that. Better would be to kind of put my money where my mouth is and actually dummy up something, like a little proof of concept. And so I asked Mike, what if I worked on the power rankings and you wrote the article, and maybe I could recruit this former student of mine, Rufus Peabody, who's like 1 year out of Yale. He's over in Las Vegas doing a sports gambling thing. Maybe I could recruit Rufus to work with me on the model. And then we do the modeling, you do the writing, and it would all work together, I think, for the journal. And they said yes. And so Rufus and I just kind of took it as a challenge to put this thing together. And then it turned out we were kind of surprised ourselves that we were decent at it. And because he's betting, he wants the thing to be bettable. He wants it to translate directly into, this is the forecasted spread. If it varies from the market, then you should place your bets and you can track it. And so we did that from the beginning, and we were serious. We wanted it to be legitimate from the beginning. And we had pretty good traction kind of from the beginning. So that's where it came from. It literally, Salfino does the article on the paper with Thaler, leads to the Wall Street Journal thing with Rufus. And then, Rufus has been another great partner to me in my life and a great collaborator. And, he's like family at this point. Both of them are like family. And it's one of the, you know this probably already, Parker, but you'll enjoy it more as an academic. These partnerships are long-lived. And it's one of the great things about that little industry that we work in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to take this opportunity to get on a little bit of a soapbox and just say, I know I have a lot of people who interact with me on Twitter and follow and ask, how do I get started in sports analytics? How can I start doing some of this work? And, one, I tell them you can be a sports analytics contributor tomorrow with the internet. You can work on data science and publish things. But I will say, academic partnerships, going to your professor and saying, hey, I want to do my thesis on an idea like this. They're going to be open. I had a professor in my PhD program who said, one of my good friends did his dissertation on the market value of baseball cards. Like, the sky is the limit. If you can find an academic advisor who will support you, that's a great way for you to kind of get onboarded into formalizing, thinking about this work and putting something in production that gets you not only noticed, but gets you kind of starting to train those skills and abilities to go in the right direction. So very, very cool to see that kind of pay off for you. One of my notes that I think we kind of hit was to ask you about mentorship, because there is a nice pipeline there of you and Thaler have a really long publication working history, and then you and Peabody also from the other direction have a long history, and it looks like that's really something important to you and really honestly inspiring to see. Just hey, I want to partner with smart people and continue to work with them. So talking about your rankings and kind of how you built them, because I think that'd be general interest for a lot of people who are listening here about kind of the technical side. Could you give us, someone who's never heard of the Massey-Peabody rankings, could you give us kind of the elevator pitch or the reason why we needed another power rating besides, the Wall Street Journal asked, but what's kind of the angle of the Massey-Peabody ratings?
Well, the idea of a power ranking is that you want to assess the true underlying ability of the team. And so I think of it just as kind of performance evaluation. I'm interested in performance evaluation. And the reason the test of that is, in my opinion, can you predict what's going to happen next? So if you truly see the quality of the entity, whether it's a team or an individual or an investment, then that should translate into what happens in the next period. So it's for me, fundamentally just performance evaluation. Can you better understand the value of the entity? And so that's what those rankings try to do. And the reason we need it, Parker, this, the reason we need it is because outcomes are so noisy. We watch football on Saturdays or Sundays or Friday nights, and these things bounce around and crazy things happen, and team wins by 35 or they lose by 17. And that doesn't really reflect the true difference between the teams. And if we want to better understand how we should feel about the teams and what's going to happen next week, we need to understand, okay, with 35-0, but what was it really? And so we try to look at statistics and team performance in a way that lets us see the true underlying ability. That's the pitch. And if we do it well, it should allow us to better forecast what's going to happen in the future. And this is one of the great fun things about having a tool like that, Parker, is that you see things happening a little bit before other people see them happening. You're in my experience, it's not all teams all years, but almost every season you're seeing something 2-3 weeks before other people are seeing it. And you just got a better lens. You got a clearer lens into the true quality of the teams, and it allows you to understand what's going to happen down the road sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my favorite things is with my, college football numbers is to go back and say like, hey, I predicted this to be 38-31 and it was 42-0. Like, what was different? What can I go back and look at what happened and be like, oh, they got, they had a penalty in this scoring opportunity. They fumbled it twice, and you break down those. And it's not that, the model is, or the power rating is wrong or right. It's that you get to look at a baseline expectation, compare it to reality, and then kind of learn something about the efficiency of the of the whole. I did want to ask a specific question. So again, read an interview where you laid some of this out, but wanted to ask a little bit deeper. You talk about kind of the two angles of, or the two aspects of the model being, one, cleaning, which is not just, cleaning the data, which is not just, putting it in rectangular format in the right matrices and everything, but contextualizing, considering the opponent and the game situation. And so first I wanted to ask, when we're looking at an NFL team, we're looking at a very noisy outcome. How much should we be able, considering the opponents and the opponent's strength? I've seen multiple studies with multiple different outcomes of maybe opponent adjusting doesn't really do much in the NFL because the playing field is very level and parity is, from year to year pretty transient. How do opponent adjustments kind of factor in your thinking about the performance of an NFL team?
Well, that's a challenging perspective, and it makes me want to go look at numbers on how we perform if we contextualize versus didn't contextualize. I'm a little skeptical that you can't get value by contextualizing. Now, you'll only get that if you have true signal on the opponents, right? I mean, if you've got junk in for the opponents, then of course the contextualization is not going to help. And that's one of the reasons, Parker, that all of us should be playing with some kind of Bayesian model where early in the season, you don't know as much because you really don't know as much. And then you're going to learn as you go through the season, and you're going to get sharper and sharper opinions about the teams. By the way, you're never going to have it all the way figured out. The priors in the sports that you and I care about the most matter all the way into the end of the season, and far more than we'd like. And philosophically, it might be uncomfortable, but if you want to have the best predictive model, you're going to have a lot of weight on those priors even deep into the season. So the priors tell us that we don't understand very, very well. They capture our uncertainty, but they also provide some signal. And I'd be surprised if you couldn't improve your models by adjusting for opponents, in at least American football, and probably
definitely. Yeah, right. The idea that's so interesting to me with context, and I don't know if you're doing any of this, but is I think that especially, and again, I focus on college football numbers mostly, and so that's there's a lot more heterogeneity of style, and the talent disparity is on the field. That sometimes teams are playing a different game, quite literally and figuratively. Yeah. But one thing that I play around with a lot is the idea of adjusting for like rushing and passing selection, because every rushing and passing play is just, in your model, I think you said, you separate out rushing and passing contribution as well as scoring and play-by-play success. The contribution to those is different, but every run play is a decision between a run and a pass, or a run and a different run. And in college specifically, if you're playing a much worse team, you're going to be much more physically talented. You can run over them in a way that is not going to have predictive value as to how you would play against a different, better team. Is there any role of selection in your model, or is the ideas of separating out a passing and rushing contribution enough to kind of identify the ways that teams might be moving the ball differently and how that's predictive?
We don't, but that doesn't mean there isn't value in doing that. In fact, we looked hard. One way of, you're playing with some probably more nuanced ideas than just this, Parker, but one simple version of what you're talking about is just matchups. Like, right now we just say we've got a team that offense is worth a certain number and the other team's worth defense is worth a certain number. And that net should tell us something about how those two units will perform when they're next to each other. Does it matter if that strength comes from rushing or from passing, and how that matches up with what comes from the other side? Like if you're a really good rushing team and they're a weak rushing defense, is that especially advantageous? We look for those kind of matchup differences, their interactions essentially. And we couldn't find them. We haven't looked for that in a long time, but in our early work, we thought that would matter, and it just didn't matter. At least working with the course data that we were working with, the aggregates were sufficient. You're also playing with, the proportion of these things and maybe even the endogeneity of that proportion. And I think all of that is great opportunity, and more power to you. We haven't looked at that yet. But it sounds very worthy to me.
And so one, I have two quotes on this, and then we'll get off the rankings and into a couple other things here. But one I loved, you got asked, how much does luck play into an NFL game? And your answer was just simply a ton, which I think is it's a very honest and open way of saying that, yeah, we really don't know. You also talked about how your weighting of your rating versus the market. And so I'm going to ask what might sound like a cynical question. But again, it's a softball, and I think it should be interpreted as that. You mentioned that you've landed on something like a 45% weighting of your rating and a 55% rating of the weighting of the market line, blending those together, and that gets kind of the best outcome for prediction. And so the question is, how does regressing against the market help you beat the market? How does regressing against the market kind of help you with the the stated mission of getting a better understanding of the relative strength of these teams?
So this is definitely more Rufus territory than Cade territory. In fact, I've learned so many things from Rufus. I'm supposed to be the professor and he was the student, and I'm supposed to have the PhD in judgment under uncertainty. But But I've learned as much from Rufus as I've learned from academic work on uncertainty and navigating uncertainty. This is an example. Rufus does that. I'm speaking for him now, and he surely would refine what I'm going to say. 55, 45. I mean, that's the exact numbers here. I don't know where that number came from. I would have said 50-50, but even then it's going to move up and down. But he's doing that because history tells us that we don't deserve the full edge that we see. I mean, this is just something you learn over time. All of your variation from the market isn't true variation. Some of it's mistakes, some of it's random. And by looking at history, you can get a better sense of, okay, how much weight should I have? But here's the flip of it, Parker. We're happy to have any weight on our model. I mean, if you look at models versus the market, most models are going to have, and you ask for the regression weights on those things and predicting outcomes, most models are going to have 0. And so you're coming in positive, you've got edge there. And that means you've got the potential to make a little something betting against the market. In practical terms, it tells you what kind of edge you actually have. And I honestly, Parker, I don't bet. I work with teams and I want to be able to tell teams that I don't bet. There's some teams that really care about these things. So I'm just really pure. I'm not betting. It's Rufus's business, but you're going to scale your bets according to your edge. And at a lot of edges, most games, you're not going to have an edge. You're not going to have a bet. So the blending in very practical terms, the blending tells you what that edge actually is. And so when you should start betting and how much you should bet based on that edge.
Makes a ton of sense.
In other words, what you think looks like a 3-point edge might actually be a 1.5 point edge, and you might not bet 1.5 point edge.
Right. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I love you saying that about it. Like, it's nice to have any edge at all, to say, hey, if you take the market and then anything I think, and that does better, that's positive. And that means 100%. Your model's adding signal. And that's a great way to think about it. I want to pivot out of the model and kind of go back to papers and talk about loser's curse. That's something we at Sumer have been talking about a lot. We're looking at draft curves. We're looking at surplus value. We're looking at the trade chart and why the trade chart is wrong and why it still gets used. So let's talk about that a little bit. One basic idea of the loser's curse is kind of natural flowing out of thinking this. There's this idea of surplus value. It's really hard to predict. And the loser's curse is generally the idea that if you're picking between the third and fourth linebacker and you pick the third one, it's really hard to make sure that third player is going to be better than the fourth player at that position or the next player available. Is there any evolution in your thinking since this paper was 2011 again, maybe? I think I have the date twice there, but this was early or mid-aughts. Looking at the draft, we've had 15 years of drafts since then. Has there been any evolution in your thinking about kind of the winner's curse and the NFL draft since you wrote that paper?
Well, we happen to be in the middle of a replication at the moment, which is fun. The world didn't need a replication of Massey-Thaler, but we thought it'd be fun to do a little more work together. And a couple of other guys are involved. And so it brings some fresh eyes and a whole bunch of new data. We're probably covering as much data since our paper as we covered in our paper. And so it's a nice doubling of the sample. So more to come is one short answer, Parker, but mostly my thinking hasn't evolved, but for the question of quarterbacks. And I've been very open to the possibility that quarterbacks have become so valued in the professional game. The sport has evolved. It's a remarkably valuable position. And if you can get enough value out of those guys, maybe there is some wisdom in drafting them high and not getting out of those picks. Because the loser's curse recommendation is the picks at the top of the draft are only the most valuable if you trade them. Essentially, if you take a pick with it, you're killing a lot of value because you have to pay so much. So you want to get out of those picks if you can. And that holds empirically, but there's an open question on whether that's true for quarterbacks. And so we're really working to pin that down in the work that we're doing right now. If you look just at something like WAR, it looks like it doesn't hold. Like there's so much more WAR for these quarterbacks. But then the question becomes, and this is Sumer kind of stuff, it's like, well, what are people paying for WAR? Because we really want to put everything into monetary units. That was one of the things we did in that paper. That was one of the challenging parts of that paper, is that we're going to translate performance on the field into dollars so that we can integrate them with costs, so that we can actually generate surplus value. You've got to make that transformation of player performance to dollars. Okay, so we've gotten pretty fancy with our war calculations. I mean, the world has. Now we need to translate the war or some version of war into dollars. And that now we have an open question. Like, does the market actually pay in proportion to the big differences we see in the war that quarterbacks produce? That's one of the pieces we're working through right now.
Not to mention kind of the second order concern of opportunity cost. You look at, I forget the stat, I said it last week and it's going to get away from my head, but the number of NFL teams that have gone to the Super Bowl the last X years that have had a rookie contract quarterback, and how there is kind of a surplus window for you to be able to build a team around it. But as soon as you pay for that quarterback, then you start cutting into your ability to build a team around them that kind of maximizes value. And, the economist in me feels very good about seeing very nice kind of marginal cost, marginal benefit curve in my head about where the hey, maybe I can get surplus war by drafting this quarterback, but is there a window where it becomes no longer worth it because then I'm impeding on my ability to kind of construct a team around them that could maximize the benefit of having all this surplus value?
100%. And this is what I've always found so exciting about what you guys are doing at Sumer. I mean, honestly, without trying to, just give you guys an in-show promotion, that challenge of how to optimally build rosters is so perpetual. Like, no one's ever cracked it. And we always think about, we're having these conversations, Parker. It's ridiculous. Like, should we take this guy at number 1 or should we take this running back at number 10? That's one piece that you can't really solve optimally unless you consider all the knock-on consequences. That what are you going to take with the other picks? Oh, and by the way, where are you going to get those positions that you don't draft in the free agency market? And how do the contracts line up? And so you've got all of these things that you're essentially having to solve simultaneously, but most of us are only thinking about one by one. So we need a system to do this thing simultaneously. I take it to be that's one of the places y'all are going. You may not be there yet, but that's kind of, I've always thought that is kind of the holy grail in NFL personnel. And I love that y'all are working on it.
Well, we love that. We'll get a t-shirt or something in the mail to you for the for the kind words. But okay. So I'm going off my notes here, but that's all right. We can just kind of live in that space for a few minutes here. It's my impression that if the NFL kind of had a year of jubilee and rosters and cap and contracts all went to zero, and you did expansion draft and a free agency system, it would be a lot easier to optimize. That one of the biggest issues with optimizing an NFL roster is that you inherit initial conditions. Is one, that you inherit initial conditions that you didn't sign up for. 2, you inherit initial conditions which severely limit what you can and cannot feasibly do. Even if you know the optimal path with certainty, you can't execute the optimal path. And 3, the window for being competitive is so short that the incentives of the owners and of the GMs might not align in terms of how long it takes to rebuild or to make a team in one's image. And so I think initial conditions are severely underrated as a limiting factor in the construction of NFL rosters.
100%. And, that should inform, for example, and most people don't want to turn down a GM job, but man, GM jobs come in different initial conditions, to use your phrase, right? Some people walk into situations that it's going to be really hard to succeed in, and others walk into much better situations. Coaches as well, but they generally don't have as much roster creation in their portfolio. But lovely, of course, 100%. And by the way, Parker, I mean, you mentioned, I think of all those you mentioned, I think the most is something about the relationship and the alignment between ownership and GM. And if they have different timeframes, that can be fatal. But more generally, I mean, what is the disposition of the owner? And that's maybe the biggest thing I've learned about professional sports from before I started working with teams until now. It's not just football; it's in other sports as well, as the heterogeneity of ownership, sophistication, and quality. As a person who grew up watching sports, kind of just a rube in West Texas, had no idea. It's all about the quarterbacks. It's all about the running backs. It's all about the starting pitchers. And no, really, it's all about the owners. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's hard. We touched on this a little earlier, and about kind of communicating these ideas and communicating, hey, you're not as good at picking a specific player as you think you are. I've worked with college coaches. I've worked with, director of football operations and guys who are doing stats, and they're smart guys. Just because they're not, statistically inclined, it doesn't mean they're not smart. Doesn't mean they're not hungry for an edge. And this kind of ties into your paper about algorithm aversion and how, a general overarching conclusion there is if I see a forecasting model make a mistake and a human make a mistake, I'm more inclined to penalize the forecasting model than I am the human. Mm-hmm. How do you account for that with ownership that might be skeptical for integrating analytics? How do you account for that to kind of lead and say, you have to make these changes, and if there's a mistake, you're gonna blame the analytics, not necessarily the random chance or the uncertainty there? That's $1 million question, I know.
It's $1 million question is exactly right. This is mostly the space that I work in now with industry, is trying to get the modelers to play better with the non-modelers and the non-modelers to play better with the modelers. And algorithm aversion is a real thing. I mean, that's co-authored with 2 other folks, and including Berkeley Dietforst, who is a lead author. It was part of his dissertation. We all had our motivations. One of my motivations was I'd seen that kind of thing happen in the real world, and I fight it still. It's a huge, huge problem. One of the things that we've come up with in that line of work is that you need to give away some control, essentially. It's really hard for someone to just accept the output of the model as gospel. They can't touch it, and then you're just supposed to use it or not. If you can allow them to play a little bit, participate, maybe move things around a little bit, it's going to go a long way towards getting their commitment and interest in the model. That's the simplest thing that I've come up with. We've come up with over the years. But you're always going to have this trouble of, in the worlds that we're working, people are wrong all the time. I mean, if these were easy problems, people wouldn't be paid as much as they are to work on them. It wouldn't be interesting. We wouldn't be watching it on TV. People are wrong all the time. Who was I just talking to? Is in the money management business. There's like a buddy of mine who's a portfolio manager. It's like, I just want to be right, 56% of the time. It's like, that's right. And that's enough to make a really good living. Okay, so we're talking about a world where the owner is going to watch his highly paid GM, who just promised him they've done everything they can. They're running the best system. We know what's going to happen. He's going to watch those picks be wrong 40% of the time. Wrong. They're going to bust in some way, a ridiculously high percentage of the time, for people to be happy. But that's the best they can do. That's the world we live in. And so you have to somehow understand there's just that much uncertainty, and you've got to stay the course. The little edges we get, Parker, from our models are small relative to the way we're pushed around by chance in the world. And so you stack these edges, but you land a Tom Brady in the 6th round, then that's going to make so much more difference than any one model. But the thing is, you're not in control of that. You're in control of the models. You're in control of the small edges. And so you've got to have an owner and management that's disciplined enough and believes in enough to stack all these small edges. There's no big edge out there. It's just a bunch of small edges, and stand tight as, success and failure outside your control washes over you. It's really hard, really hard. If it were easy, we'd be making so much more progress in sports than we are right now.
Yeah, if it was easy, I would not have a job in sports analytics. There wouldn't be so many people trying to solve it. And so in one way, certainly glad for the complexity. I have one more kind of general question for you. Before I do that, I do want to put out a call. If you're watching on YouTube or wherever the 7 locations this is out, Twitter, whatever, if you want to reply with a question, toss one in the comments. I would be happy to ask 1 or 2 to Cade while he's here. And while we wait on that and see if that happens, I did want to ask you a little bit about Wharton Moneyball and about the podcast, and 1, how that got started, and 2, how you feel like talking to people across different disciplines of sports analytics. You have the Data Golf founder a couple of days ago talking to people in baseball and talking to people in betting, how that helps shape how you think about the NFL and how you think about applying analytics and risk and uncertainty to the situations that you're working in.
So the remarkable thing to me, Parker, is that the issues are largely the same across sports, and not even just across sports, but across industry. So it's fun in that way, but it's also kind of affirming and reinforcing of how fundamental these issues are. Just like we were just talking with the models versus the non-modelers, that people run into that everywhere. A few years ago I think it was 2020, the first year of the pandemic. It was an especially bad year, 20 or 21, especially bad year for firefighters. It was 20 in the Northwest. Forestry services out there battling these big fires. And we thought, I wonder if they'd used analytics. I'd be surprised if they don't use analytics in this firefighting business out there. So we dug into it. Turns out there's a number of folks that work for the National Forestry Service, building models, looking at historical data, really sophisticated analytics to improve the success, the effectiveness of the guys fighting fires. They even call it Moneyball for fire. And they run into the exact same issues that we've all run into in sports, trying to convince other people to use them. Now, they've made a lot of progress, but it's remarkable to me how universal the issues are. And it's kind of bolstering in a way. It gives me confidence that the stuff that we see in one place is relevant somewhere else. Ideas and prescriptions we have from one place are relevant. Go into money management, go into technology diffusion in healthcare. Again and again and again, you see the same stuff. Doing the show has made that more plain to me. And I think we see things a little more clearly as a result.
That's great. And certainly a great listen and fun to see. It does feel like there is kind of the underlying problem that everyone's trying to attack, and seeing how people attack it differently and interpret it and how that shapes their worldview is fascinating. I have one more from Sean Donahue that I'll throw in here, and then we'll get out of here with a final question. Sean asks about how you emphasize the need for sample size to coaches or teams. And I think the second half is probably where I'll direct this question. Where's the balance between trusting data and then the outcomes of the wins and losses, and how important those are to a GM? A GM can be right 16 times and go 2-14 and still get fired. So how do you balance those kind of process versus results questions?
Well, it's with great sympathy, because I realize that ultimately you do care about the wins and losses. It's one of the fascinating things to me about being a coach in particular, because you have to be a sophisticated consumer of what's going on. You have to understand it's all about the process. But then to motivate these guys maximally, which is a big part of your job, you have to act as if all that matters is the wins and the losses. So I think it's fascinating how coaches balance that thing. And we've got the same with GMs and owners. Because ultimately, I mean, this is something that I've come to appreciate about these jobs, is that they're political jobs. Even the ownership of sports is a political enterprise. And for someone to stand in the face of bad luck year after, what they would consider bad luck, you never really know, by the way, whether it's bad luck or not. We might believe it is, but you don't know for sure.
Cade, it's bad luck when it goes poorly against my team. It's all skill when it goes for my team.
Right. Okay. So you're just like everybody else, Parker, despite that econ PhD. Exactly. So it takes a certain not just sophistication, but strength and political will. I've had sophisticated owners say, I mean, I might have to let this guy go. Or in particular, the quote I'm thinking about, had that thing not broken just right at the end of the season, I was probably going to have to let this person go. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, I mean, that's just chance. Is a perfectly good coach in this case, that the owner's saying, but I was going to have to. And owners have different tolerances for how much of that they can put up with. Coaches, same thing. The in-game strategy really isn't my deal, but it's a close cousin, and it's a part of what our world does. Coaches have to put up with a lot of that stuff going against them. Some of them don't have the interest in doing that. Some of them don't want to fight those battles. And so I'm greatly sympathetic to the political forces, but the only way to get through that is a deep commitment that you're on the right path, a deep commitment to the process. And it is hard. I can jump back to the sports gambling world with Rufus. We would put out these picks whenever we were publishing in the Wall Street Journal, pick 4 games, 5 games a week or something. And, you kind of live or die with this ridiculous small sample of, we're 2-3 over the weekend, or 1-4. Oh my God, we're 1-4. Like, you're going to pick hundreds of games over the course of the season. 3 or 4 over a weekend means nothing. And yet it feels, and you start going, is our model wrong? And I'm like, Rufus, is something wrong with the model? And these guys, because they're sports bettors, they're much more accustomed to dealing with these vicissitudes. They just become much stronger at dealing with the bad luck, the negative variance, positive variance. And I think the trouble with folks who are in these in ownership positions, GM positions, they just don't get that many reps. I mean, it's an impossibility, because it's only when you get those calluses that you get accustomed to it. You just don't get enough reps. These GMs might get 1 go. They might get 3 years. It's almost impossible. It's almost impossible to put up with bad luck in such a short sample.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Eric Eager has it's a funny thing where he always talks about how coaches should play Madden more so they get more reps of like when to use timeouts
Exactly.
during the season.
Exactly. No, that's not even a joke. That's like
Yeah.
legit, 100% legit. We need to find ways to get them. I mean, this is one of the things I like about Sims. You start appreciating. I mean, I'm sure you probably do this, Parker, with you have season-long Sims with your college numbers, but I love running Sims, and you come out with, okay, here's a bracket. I mean, it's one thing to look at the averages, but it's another to go in and get a bracket. Here's a playoff bracket, and Sim number 1,632, and you look at the 4 teams in there, and TCU's in there, and you're like, no way, TCU in the playoffs? Or you got to be kidding me. But that's what the Sim produced. You're like, well, and then it turns out every now and then the world actually produces that as well. You get a better appreciation for variation. That's one of the great things a Sim will do. And a Sim, Madden is basically a Sim. You get a much better appreciation for variation from a good Sim.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's great the simulation gives you a baseline and you can compare it to reality and kind of understand how much variance plays a role there. Cade, I don't want to take any more of your time. We've hit 45 minutes and I want to be respectful of that. I appreciate you being here so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Where's the best place for people to find you and kind of follow your work on the internet?
I'm on Twitter at BC Massey on Twitter. Not super active, but I'm there some. And I'm also a part of at W Moneyball, our Wharton Moneyball account from the podcast at W Moneyball. So Twitter's probably the best way to stay on top of it. But papers are published on our Wharton website as well. So you can track me down that way.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for being here. This has been another episode of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm your host, Parker Fleming. I'll be back here next week with my colleague and my friend, Tej Seth, with another exciting guest for Cade Massey. Thank you, sir, for being here, and we'll catch all of you next time.